Usually when we hear the word slavery, we think of African slavery, when peoples were taken from Africa, forcefully brought across the ocean to the Americas, and forced to work on plantations as slaves. However, that kind of makes us think that we got slaves from Africa because they were Africans, or maybe because they were Africans, we made them slaves, but that's actually not completely true. Before we took slaves out of Africa, there was slavery happening all over the world. Aztecs in Mexico, or what is now Mexico, had slaves. The Aztecs would enslave people from the area around them, even people who looked like them. Egyptians had slaves. They might have been people from the area around Egypt, or even people from Egypt who would have looked like them or close to them. Middle East had slaves. Famous explorers and seafaring peoples from Norway were traders and slaves. Europeans had European-looking slaves. They later started calling them serfs, which maybe was supposed to make it sound better than slave, but it was pretty much the same thing. And even Africans had African slaves. Native Americans had Native American slaves. Now, I'm not saying this to say that, gee, since everybody had slaves, slavery was an okay thing. I'm not sure that anybody who was a slave would think it was an okay thing. When we're trying to take something else that we know and use it to make what we're doing okay, we call that justification. So just because people in history had slaves doesn't mean that it's a justification or reason that it was okay for anybody to have slaves. But the difference is important. So the type of slavery we're talking about in America is different than some of this ancient slavery that we're talking about that happened in Central America, in the Americas, in Africa, in the Middle East, and even slaves taken by the Vikings. A lot of times, slaves were not slaves because they were born slaves. They might be slaves because they owe money. They were a criminal and slavery might have been their punishment. Maybe they were given away by their parents because their parents could afford to take care of them. A very common way to become a slave would be captured in war by your enemy. Okay, so all these are ways that you could become slaves in different parts of the world. But what we need to pay attention to here is that in a lot of these places, the slavery wasn't necessarily permanent. You might be freed after a certain amount of time. You might be able to buy your own freedom, and you might be able to work off your debt. And in a lot of places, your children were not automatically slaves just because you found yourself in a situation that made you a slave. So how do we end up with African slavery and thinking that just because you're an African, that is what made you a slave? Where do we come from that idea? Way, way, way back when, people weren't as terribly concerned about things like color. So if you were from this part of the world, you might think everybody else around you wasn't as great as you, but maybe not because of your color, maybe because they lived differently than you, or maybe because the area they lived in had a different climate, or maybe some people would be considered warriors and some people would be considered scholars. They were different than you, but we weren't divided on lines of because I am white and because you are black. And slavery was not defined by color. Over here, about in this area, in a place called Greece, the Greeks might think you were a slave, or not a slave, but they might think you were less than them if you were from anywhere around them, because they just thought that their culture was better than your culture. So what used to happen is in this part of the world, they would get slaves from this part of the world, okay? They would get slaves from the areas around them for some of the reasons that we've already described. And the word slave tends to come from the word Slavic, which is this part of the world. So people who are of Slavic origin a lot of times tend to be slaves in this part of the world. So why did things change? Well, it also changed about the same time we started exploring, about the same time right before Christopher Columbus. People used to get all sorts of good stuff over here from Asia. Silk, spices, gunpowder, all sorts of good stuff. And they would get it from there and bring it back to Europe. Well, what happened was once this part of Europe was taken over by the Muslims, they wouldn't allow the people over here to go this way anymore. And so the people over here who used to use slaves on their farms or sugar plantations or things like that, because actually started growing sugar a while ago here, okay? They used to get their slaves from over here. Well, problem with that. They can't go this way anymore. So they can no longer trade in that direction, and they can't get their slaves in that direction. Now, a guy by the name of Prince Henry, who was from Portugal. Portugal is like right on the edge of Spain over here. He wanted to explore and find a new way to get over here. So he taught people how to sail in a special school, and they started to look for a way around Africa to get to Asia. As they started traveling around Africa, they would stop in different places and trade. And one of the things that they would trade for was slaves. And they began to take those slaves out of Africa and back to their home country. And then they started taking slaves out of Africa to colonies that they made over here in the New World in South America. Now remember that word I talked about before, justification? So they had to come up with a good reason why it was okay for them to go to Africa and purposely take these people out of Africa and bring them all over the world and make them slaves. So Prince Henry needed some help by a buddy by the name of Gomez Inez de Zerara. And I'm not sure if I'm saying his whole name right, but Zerara is pretty easy to remember. And what he did is he wrote a book. And he wrote a book called The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. And Guinea is a country in Africa. And so basically what he did is he made it look like this going into Africa and taking over this place, and Prince Henry sending all these explorers out made him this great person. And one of the things that they did to make it seem like it was okay is they had to convince people that the people living in Africa were not as good as them and that they needed them. So one of the justifications that they came up with for taking slaves out of Africa is that it helped them because they would then take these slaves and make them Christian. So slavery was a good thing for these people in Africa. That is what we call justification, finding a reason to do something you shouldn't. So what happens after a while is all sorts of other countries begin to come over and explore in North and South America, all sorts of other European countries. We learned about this. And they want to make money there. And so one of the things they do is start growing things and start making these plantations. But the conditions are bad and they can't get people to work on them. They're like, nope, not really willing to do that anymore. So they decide to bring in labor that they can force to work on the plantations, that they don't have to pay, and that the labor will be for life. Because a lot of these other people could just leave, or if they were indentured servants, they didn't have to work for life. And that became a problem that we'll talk about later. And so what they decided to do is they said, well, why don't we kind of do what Portugal did? Why don't we come over here to Africa, take some of these people from Africa all the way across the ocean, and have them work on plantations in the New World where we don't have enough people to work.